Hello everyone. Some of the scariest kinds of people out there are ones who can commit murder. Someone who is so devoid of human compassion that they can willingly take another human's life and believe that they are doing something good. However, there is something to be said about a person or a group of people who share this dark form of sociopathy and can actually convince a large group of people of the same convoluted ideals. Some people call this the forming of not just a cult, but a cult with a truly evil side. Today, I'm going to share 3 cult stories that are really unsettling. However, only 2 of them are factual. One is entirely false. At the end, you can decipher which one you think is true or not. Let's begin with story number 1. Blood atonement. In most societies, being married to multiple people is illegal. However, back in the 1950s, 3 brothers didn't want polygamy to become a thing of the past. Of the 3 brothers, they all had a very different mindsets of other activities, especially 2 of them. One, named Joel, born in 1923, and his brother named Ernest, born in 1925, argued about numerous aspects of their new church, which was initially called the Church of the Firstborn of the Fullness of Times. Regardless, they set up their church in Mexico in 1955. They chose this location because the Mexican government didn't care if people still practiced polygamy and allowed this church to take place. Joel was considered the president, and Ernest was second in command. There was also a 3rd brother being in high power too. Things continued like this for the next 12 years, and they gained a massive following. However, in 1967 is when things between the 2 brothers came to a crossroads. Ernest wanted to bring back the practice called blood atonement, which meant that if you did something deemed evil by Ernest, then the only way to go into heaven was to be killed and have your blood spilled. Joel had no interest in this becoming a part of their church. This is when Ernest decided to take matters into his own hands, and in the late 1960s began preaching against his own brother. He started his own church against his brother's wishes, naming it the Church of the Firstborn of the Lamb of God, which still practiced polygamy, but also now would allow blood atonement. Some of Joel's followers switched their loyalty to Ernest. In 1972, Ernest would order his first blood atonement victim. It would be no other than his own brother, Joel. 2 of his followers, both former followers of Joel, murdered Joel by shooting him in the head. Ernest had the belief that this would be an awakening for all of Joel's remaining supporters, that their leader had committed an evil act and he needed to be killed. To his dismay, all this did was lead to them to call for his arrest, which is exactly what the Mexican authorities did. Ernest went to jail, but only for 1 year. During this year, Ernest continued to preach that he was one of God's representatives, and he could decide who should die for their sins. He continued to amass more and more followers who believed in him. When Ernest was released, he returned to his place as the leader of the Church of the Firstborn Lamb of God, and he wasted no time in orchestrating his next victim. That victim would be his other brother, the one who took Joel's place. His name was Vernon. Vernon, the next man on Ernest's hit list, became aware of what his newly released brother was planning on doing, and he immediately went into hiding. Ernest tried to make a statement at this time in an effort to flush out his brother. He raided the town in Mexico where Vernon's church was located, throwing firebombs and shooting at random houses. Actually, Ernest didn't perform this act himself. He just ordered one of his wives and a few other followers to do his dirty work. This attack killed 2 men and injured 13 others, but was unsuccessful at locating Vernon, as he had already fled to another country. One of Ernest's followers became upset at the violence and said that she wanted to leave. She was also swiftly executed by a follower of Ernest for this request. In 1975, Ernest moved his church to California in the United States, and he set his sights on other polygamous leaders in the area. He demanded they switch their allegiance to him. One leader in Utah denounced Ernest. This man was also executed by 2 of Ernest's followers. His reign of terror continued for years. Most people believed that people who still followed Ernest at this point were only following him out of fear. He would call for people's death with more and more frequency. One unlucky victim was a woman named Rebecca. She was pregnant at the time and threatened to go to the police. She was also one of Ernest's daughters. His true motive was still to kill Vernon, who was still in hiding. He planned this by ordering the murder of another leader of a polygamous group, in the hopes that Vernon would go to his funeral. He sent 3 followers to the funeral, but they claimed that too much police were present and they couldn't perform any execution. This final murder led to the capture and conviction of Ernest for ordering the kill. He was sentenced to life in prison in Utah, but continued to write up 50 names of people he believed should die. Ernest himself died in 1981, but his followers would get a hold of this list and continue in his name. It is believed that 25 more people were murdered by Ernest's orders, even though he was long deceased. Story number 2, suicide or murder. If I told you about a dangerous cult that believed in following the 10 Commandments and preached the word of Jesus Christ, well, you might not like that the word dangerous was thrown in there. That's many churches located in most of the world. However, the following story of this cult had them differ greatly. It led to many extremes of people who decided to join this group. They were named the Movement for the Restoration of the 10 Commandments of God. It was located in the eastern part of Africa. This cult was initiated by 2 members in the late 1980s, who we will name Connie and Joseph. The 2 claimed that they were visited by the Virgin Mary and were warned about the future apocalypse. They said they were told that the world would end on December 31st, 1999, and joining their movement was the only way to get into heaven and avoid eternal damnation. If you joined this cult, you were strongly urged to no longer speak, in fear of breaking the 9th commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor." Most members of the group only communicated through sign language. They would fast for most of the week, only having 1 meal on Mondays and Fridays. Sex was completely forbidden, as was using soap. During the late 1980s, this part of Africa was subject to a lot of political and social turmoil. The rise of a dictator, a civil war, and even a disease wreaked havoc on this part of the country. Some people became pessimistic about the Roman Catholic Church, as it was doing nothing to help their country. The movement for the restoration of the 10 Commandments of God was not the only movement that was created during this time. One member of this cult even was quoted saying, "We joined this movement as a protest against the Roman Catholic Church." Connie and Joseph were easily able to convince people that the world was going to end in the year 2000, based on everything that was going on in their country at this time. They even convinced nuns and priests to join their cult, it had amassed a following of nearly 500 people. By 1998, the cult had built an entire community. It even had a school. It was built amongst a pineapple and banana plantation. Rumors started to swirl about child labor, people being kidnapped, very unsanitary conditions, but the government allowed it to remain open nonetheless. Connie continued to preach that the Virgin Mary continued to speak with her through a hidden telephone, and still claimed that the world was ending in the year 2000. Well, January 1st, 2000 came, and as we now know, nothing happened. No apocalypse took place. It was nearly immediate when members of the cult began to question their two leaders. Some of the members who were forced to sell their belongings to fund this cult began demanding their money back. The leaders of the cult immediately set a new date, saying that they heard wrong, and March 17th was set as the new day of the apocalypse. They proposed a large party to celebrate their final days. They bought 70 crates of soft drinks and had a roast of 3 large bulls. Reports indicate that while this party was taking place, people recall hearing a loud explosion. Some believing that this was the start at the end of the world. However, something very different was going on. One of the buildings had erupted in flames. Inside were 530 cult members. Sadly, every single person inside the building perished. Reportedly, Connie and Joseph were also inside the building and died in the fire. Several followers at nearby locations tragically also died. People who had been drinking the soft drink provided by the leaders. It was determined that they had all been poisoned. The number is believed to have been 395 people. Reports that followed initially believed that this was a mass suicide, but further digging revealed at no point did members of this cult mention a mass suicide. The conclusion? This was a mass murder, totaling a death toll of 935 cult members. It was believed that Connie and Joseph orchestrated this when their prediction of doomsday failed, and they wanted to eliminate their followers. The poisoned drinks and the fact that the building had caught fire and was boarded up, preventing anyone from leaving, was all part of the evidence leading to this conclusion. There are several reports that Connie and Joseph are in fact still alive and did not perish in the fire. If true, they would be some of the most wanted fugitives in African history. Story number 3, a United Kingdom horror story. Traveling through England in the 1930s would be something many historians would love. Witnessing such a simple way of life compared to the fast-paced environment most of us live in today's world. That's just what one man named Charles, aged 32, experienced with his 2 brothers, Davy and John, both 34 and 36 respectively. In 1934, all 3 Americans were traveling overseas to experience new sights and sounds. They boarded a large vessel for work that would travel from New York to England. This trip alone would take roughly a week. While in England, they would spend up to a month traveling through different parts of Europe. At least that was the plan. Charles, the most adventurous of the 3, always said he wondered if he would ever return. The idea of a new life in a new continent brought him a lot of excitement. The 3 would always agree on the length that they all wanted to stay, but Charles did convince the 3 of them to travel the countryside before trying to find some work in London, as it would have been much harder after that. Davy and John both agreed, and all 3 of them were able to rent a car and they bought a map, so the 3 of them wouldn't get lost. Their boat landed in London, but they quickly started their journey north, hitting other cities like Birmingham, Manchester, then traveling out east to Leeds, also stopping at many of the towns along the way. Eventually, about 2 hours east of Leeds, they got to a small town that wasn't on the map. While driving through this, they claimed that it looked almost deserted. When they got out to what would have been the downtown, they saw a few individuals standing there. So they stopped their vehicle and got out to see what they could learn of this town that wasn't on the map. One female, who looked to be almost 80, spoke another language. None of the three of them could understand her, but she did gesture to them to follow her. The three decided, why not? And they followed her into what they believed was one of the local pubs. The layout of the downtown was very different than the other small towns they had driven through. Some of the buildings didn't even have a roof or a front door. When the three brothers walked into this one pub, they noticed that they were immediately outside again. It was no longer just the older lady. Here in front of them was at least 30 people, a combination of men and women. They all wore the same outfits with a symbol on their chest. It looked like a cross with rosary beads and maybe some kind of liquid dripping below it. John, the oldest of the three, said he immediately felt uneasy and quietly said to his brothers that they should leave. Something wasn't right. He turned around and noticed the group of people were blocking the door that they had come in. Yet, no one was speaking. They were all just staring at Charles, Davy, and John. Unfortunately, this is where the story gets a little hazy. So far, these accounts are all told by John, as he left this town in the same car that they all arrived in. But he left alone. His brothers were not with him. According to John, at this point, one of the members of the cult approached him, and oddly, that's all he remembers. He woke up later, back in his car, not even in the town anymore. He had no idea where he was. He was woozy, but ended up driving himself around and found signs leading to leads. He was confused. He wasn't able to mentally retrace his steps. He was uninjured, but the big fact remained. He was alone. He contacted the police and immediately told them what had happened, although he wasn't able to tell them that much. He pointed on the map roughly to where he thought this town was located, but he was unable to find it when he drove around the area he thought the town was located. This would go on for months after the disappearance. A full investigation was launched, and John was even a suspect as well. In early 1935, police closed the search for Charles and Davy. John, however, was not ready to give up. He continued driving the area aimlessly in hopes of finding that town. Eventually, one day he did. In June of 1935, John found the little decrepit town that he stumbled across with his brothers nearly a year earlier. He wanted to play it smart. He carefully traced his steps and went to contact the police, as to not enter the town alone. When John returned with police, he searched the town. It was quickly discovered that the town was deserted, and according to the locals, it had been deserted for nearly 20 years. It was a small coal mining town that was left abandoned in 1913. At max, it had a population of 300 people at its peak. John's brothers, they were nowhere to be seen. In fact, they were never seen again. To this day, there is no conclusive answer on what happened. Now, you may be disappointed to learn that that's all there is to this story. John's story made the news. It was even turned into a novel in 1941, and his family back home never got over losing 2 of their 3 sons. Some people developed theories about what had happened. Most commonly was that John made all of this up. He murdered his 2 brothers and made up a group of people who didn't speak to them. But this would have been such a weird story to make up to cover up a murder. And ultimately, he was never arrested for any crimes. However, there is one theory, one that sadly came to light after John passed away in the war in 1943. This is that theory. Divine Order of the Royal Arms of the Great 11. That name may not sound familiar now, but in the 1920s in Wales, it likely did. This was a cult formed by 2 women, Ruth and her mother, May. These 2 claimed that they were visited by angels and would be led to gold and silver so they, and any follower, could be wealthy forever. They believed mostly in animal sacrifices, but on occasion would also bury adult men only in copper caskets. They had to be buried alive, deep in the soil, to reveal the riches. This cult went on, mostly undetected, from 1928 to 1945, when the two women were finally apprehended in England. It had amassed a following of not even 100 people. Ruth, the daughter, gave details on what they did over the last 17 years. To some people's horror, they admitted to kidnapping grown men, using chloroform to knock them out and bury them, in hopes that it would lead to riches. They often took residence in abandoned small towns, something the UK had no shortage of. But they moved locations often when they were unable to find any wealth. Ruth was questioned specifically about Charles and Davy, but she had no recollection. It was never fully confirmed if these two were buried alive, but most believe that is tragically the fate of the two brothers. Why John was spared and let go, we will never know. So that concludes our 3 stories of horrifying cults. Any guesses on the fake one? Story number 1, the man who believed he could decide who should die for their sins. Or 2, the failed apocalypse prediction that led to a mass murder of nearly 1,000 people. Or 3, 2 brothers who potentially were tragically buried alive as a sacrifice. Let's start with story number 1. The Church of the Firstborn Lamb of God, who believed in blood atonement, is a very true story. Dubbed the Mormon Manson, Ervil LeBaron, his real name, is responsible for dozens of deaths that spanned over 2 decades. Joel LeBaron and Verlin LeBaron were the full names of his 2 brothers. Story number 2, the horrific mass murder, was one I could hardly imagine was true when I researched it. This story took place in Uganda, with the names of the founders being Credonia and Joseph. So that means that story number 3 in the UK is completely false. Personally, this episode was very weird to research. However, I had a lot of fun coming up with the fake story, even if it was obvious to you which one was fake. I hope you all enjoyed this, and please have a wonderful day.